When I tell people I'm a language teacher, one of the things they often say is, but do you not have to speak all the languages of your students?
Right, how do you teach students if
Exactly.
you don't
Do we
speak
need
their
to?
language? Do we need to? So when I went to Japan to teach, my first teaching job was in Japan. Before going to Japan, I spent quite a bit of time learning Japanese because I thought, well, I better learn as much Japanese as possible before I go there because it will be really useful. And then sure enough, I got there, and what I realised was that students expect you to teach them in English, keep the language of the lesson English, and really I had very little use for Japanese, and so it can be useful. We'll come on to that in a second, but the question of do you need to? Well, absolutely not.
When I started my teacher training, it was a multilingual class. I was teaching in the UK, and I think there were maybe 12 students and maybe 10 different nationalities in that class. So there was no way I was going to be able to speak the language of every single student.
You couldn't do it, and it wouldn't have been fair to do it anyway.
No,
right?
and if I'd spoken the language of one or two and just spoke their language, it wouldn't have been fair on the others. So
I remember seeing that from time to time as well. Like there is a tendency actually for teachers who do know the language of the students very well. They almost use the lesson as an excuse to practice the language,
yes.
and it's horrible to see. It's not nice to see. Not good for the students.
There are language exchanges, which are a different thing, but not with the lesson.
Yeah, really, it is best practice to stay in the language of the lesson while you're teaching. So what role, if you do know the language, or let's say you speak Spanish and you want to teach Spanish students, what role does knowing Spanish in that
So
area?
having some knowledge of the language really helps you to anticipate problems students are going to have with the language. So, for example, if it's a Russian student, they're probably going to have difficulty with articles, with a and an and the, because it's different in Russian, for example. So becoming aware of those pitfalls really helps you teach that nationality better.
It's almost like a specialization, isn't it? The more Spanish students you get used to teaching, the more you know how to guide them through. If you know they're going to have this particular problem, you can teach it in that way.
And you don't even need to be fluent in that language. You will just develop knowledge of those areas.
Right, because
the more you teach.
Even if you don't speak the language, if you only teach students from a certain nationality, over time you'll get used to the kind of mistakes that they make, and you'll adapt your teaching accordingly. But what about complete beginners? I mean, if you're teaching a complete beginner and you don't know their language, what on earth do you do?
It's challenging. It's certainly more challenging, but again, it's possible. When my first year teaching abroad, I was in Poland, and I was a kind of absolute beginner in Polish, and I was teaching Polish absolute beginners of English as well. And we did it. We got through it. We managed.
How? What did you do?
So keeping
miming,
it simple. Yeah. I mean, that was part of it. So I think the important thing is that the language that you're teaching is quite simple. Of course, it's simple kind of nouns and objects, very simple grammar as well. So the language you're teaching is simple, and you just need to use very, very simple language when you're teaching. And things like miming and gestures and pictures.
Flashcards with pictures.
Flashcards, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, the main thing I think that changes when you're teaching low level, like very beginner, just as if you're teaching kids as well, is that you tend to get through a lot of stuff faster. You have to do more things because you can't stop and chat like
exactly.
we are. You have you're saying this is a cat, this is a dog.
Yes.
Right, now what's next? So you have to prepare more, and things are faster paced. But it's actually relatively rare to be teaching complete beginners. I mean, if you're working in a face-to-face language school, it can happen depending on your scenario. But certainly when you work for yourself online, you almost never teach complete beginners. It very, very rarely happens. But the point is that you can choose. So you can decide, who do I want to teach? And in fact, I normally recommend in CIOT that people don't teach students who are not already at an intermediate level, where they can already have a conversation. Because there's no need to, you don't need to, and it just makes your life an awful lot easier.
Absolutely, and you've got that freedom to choose.
You've got that freedom to choose. So, speaking the student's language, I understand why you might feel it would be nice, but you really don't have to at all.